Oh, you know what? I was going to let you be there.
I know.
This was presumably what was going to be otherwise left in my.
Yes. Much less surprising this way.
Yes.
Where did that come from? I can imagine the hand.
Okay, we're covered.
Good. I went down there. There's a sign on the window saying it's flooding.
Nice.
Closed.
And no, so piercing guys of an odd.
That is just that is why
You'll probably go buy some gas. But,
oh god.
yeah, watching that. Seeing like get up close.
Hi. So if anyone can open a ticket with the meeting trouble thing, can tell them that the clicky doesn't work. Let's say clicky of justice doesn't work. Yeah. Might get a new one. Okay, I'll start the blue sheets.
That's been going for a while.
Yeah.
Cool stuff. I just don't operate, so it's good. If you're panicked, if you're panicked, we collaborate. Yes. You did it once. Yeah. You did it once. Yeah, we're
Cool.
yeah. So I tried that.
Yeah.
I'd actually like to be here sometime because that's the point. That's what matters.
Oh, yeah. That should.
Yeah. You're kidding.
This is tricky. Really?
So it escalated to the point where
Honestly,
that was
now it's just like.
I didn't send over any slides, but I found it in I also ran out of time, so I didn't.
right. Still there?
Yes, okay.
Okay, I got it. Oh, I got it. That makes sense. I'm with the program now. I was confused before, but now I'm with y'all.
Okay, people, it's 23 minutes past the hour, so we might as well get started. Please take your seats and sign the blue sheets.
I understand that overall 50, but exactly.
Oh, okay.
I get exponentially more every day.
Is that right?
Okay, so as most of you have heard, Rich could not be joining us this IETF, so I'm alone here. Please have mercy. This is the Note-Well, which I'm sure you've seen several times. This is the new version that has a link to the privacy policy. Otherwise, it's not much change since last time. But as always, this is only a summary, and if you want to know the actual stuff, consult a lawyer or read all of the BCPs there at the bottom. Preferably both. So our agenda for today. We're doing part of it now, the agenda bashing. The blue sheets are going around. We need a note taker. And somebody, we can't proceed without a note taker. Anybody raises their hand? Thank you, Phil. Okay, and a JabberScribe. What? Not our own Etherpad? Fine. Google Docs is fine as well. And
Chair, he definitely pays his dues. Like to work it. Raise your hand.
okay, thank you. Good. So we've seen the note well. Any agenda bashing? Good. So let's go forward. By the way, is Richard Barnes in the room? Richard? That's going to be a problem. Okay, well, hope he gets here by the time we get to him. So, document status. ACME CAA is expiring, though it has been in working group last call, so I'm not really sure about the status. Rich seems to think that it's ready to proceed because we have gone through working group last call. But I want to hear it from the author first, so I'll talk to the author and hopefully push this to the ISG. The two email drafts, we have new versions from this month. For the TLS document, we have a new version from today that just adds POP3. Alexei, since you didn't send slides, could you just come up and say, give us a short status report about this?
Yeah, Alexei here. So for the most part, I had lots of open issues in documents, and based on feedback in Singapore and just thinking about them, I cleaned up the document and removed them. So as you said, other than adding POP3, most of the changes are making it cleaner, just removing comments and GBD type of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how long do you think before it's ready for next call, or are we waiting for something?
Actually, I think it's probably ready for working group last call. It would be nice to see if I missed anything major.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I'm not very familiar with writing ACME extensions, so it's entirely possible I forgot some kind of consideration or use case. So, yeah.
Okay. So also we have the ACME service provider and telephone, and we're going to have a presentation about them a little later, and ACME IP and ACME TLS ALPN, we're also having presentations, so we'll see. So what's missing? Well, there's the base document, and we thought it would be ready by last time, and it wasn't. And then we decided that we made enough changes that it required another working group last call, and then a lot of issues came up, and that those were addressed and fixed, and we have a new version 10, and I kind of practiced with Richard the kind of back and forth banter. I'll ask him if it's ready, and say, yeah, everything's ready, just push it out. And then there's a new PR from yesterday, I think. So Richard's still not in the room. No. Okay, so we'll discuss it later, but unless there's something, Jacob Hoffman was Q. Okay, let's listen to that.
Hey, I just wanted to chime in that PR 415 is editorial only, so that's a big change.
That includes the new PR?
Yep, 415.
Okay, so we'll get that resolved, and then, oh, here's Richard. So then we'll get that resolved and push it to the ISG again. And I could press the submit to the ISG button, but we've already done that like 6 months ago, so might as well not do it again. Hi, Richard.
Yeah, ship it.
Thanks, Jacob.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Cool. And you've seen the new PR?
Yeah, I think CPU just merged it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the minor clarifications that were requested on the list during the last call. So that's merged now. So I think it's ready for a pub request and IETF last call. That's the last thing.
Okay, great.
All right, thanks.
So, okay, so there's no button to push because it's already been done. So we'll just ask our new AD to take it over and get the IETF last call going. Okay, so presentations. You can do that.
Sure, why not?
Hey. Among the last. So next is Roland with ACME IP.
Hello. So this is a document that was actually adopted sometime last year, I think. And there's basically been no movement on it, but Rich thought it would be a good idea to have a quick overview. So this basically adds extensions to the existing document to provide for validation of IP identifiers. Currently, we only have identifiers and challenges for validating DNS identifiers. So this would allow us to use ACME to issue certificates for containing IP addresses. So the existing HTTP and TLS ALPN, which we'll talk about next, methods will work with IP identifiers basically without any modification. The only thing is, we don't resolve DNS basically. And then this document also introduces a new method called reverse-dns, which basically is the DNS method from the original document, except for there's an additional step where we look up the reverse zone, look up any PTR records, and if there is a PTR record, we then do the DNS lookup at the target of the PTR record. And these are all CAB BR 3225 valid methods, so they can be used by CAs. Here's the reverse DNS method. It's quite simple. Generate the reverse mapping, look up the PTR records, append the prefix like we do in the DNS challenge, and then you look up text records at that name and check if any of them contain the validation token that has been generated.
Yeah, seem to have a question on the floor.
Hi, Eric Riscorla. No hat. So I recognize that reverse DNS is valid according to 3225. However, it does not actually have anything to do with control of the IP address space. And so it's quite different from the DNS situation, where actually if you controlled, so look at it this way. If you control the DNS for a host, you actually can cause traffic to go to that location. So that's constructive control of the domain name. If you control reverse, like in Internet ARPA for the host, that doesn't do anything. It has nothing, like Internet ARPA can go nowhere. And nevertheless, it would still be possible to get the IP address.
Yep.
So the fact that this is, I don't think the fact that it's that it works under 3225 is dispositive. Like IETF shouldn't do stupid things just because it's CABF did.
Okay. I think control of the reverse zone. Let's let Stevie say his piece. I think control of the reverse zone is, if it's enough for the CAB forum, I'm not sure there's unless there's a solid argument that an attacker may be able to gain control of the reverse zone and therefore they can issue certificates for that IP address. Well, if they control the reverse zone, then something much worse has happened.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Control of the reverse zone has no operational implications whatsoever for whether the traffics go out of the right place. And so, it's just not true.
Sure. So we don't trust IANA to control the reverse zone, but we do trust them to.
No, I don't trust that once IANA has delegated the reverse zone to random people control the IP address, that they're properly managing it, because it's not a security critical part of the infrastructure the way the forward zone is.
That's a valid argument. I should be brought up on the list. I think the fact that we've had no argument about this in the last 6 months is, and this is the first time we're hearing about this.
Well, I'm happy to bring it up on the list.
Yeah, let's have it there.
I mean, I guess we have this meeting time. That seems like usually the time when one discusses these things.
Yep.
So I guess I'm not sure quite why you think I should bring it up on the list so we can discuss it in the list when we're right here.
Well, I personally think that that's a valid method, and it's not.
Do you think it's valid because it's written down in a document? Or do you think it's valid because it's secure?
I think it's secure.
Okay, but I just told you why it's not secure, so I'm going to need you to walk me through it.
I personally disagree with your argument. I don't think.
Okay, but I'm listening for your argument as opposed to just disagreeing.
Okay. I think we can, if we can't trust that Ian or whoever, A and Nick, are not properly delegating trust to the reverse zones, then there's a much more severe problem here. And I think, that this has been going on for, however long the BRs have allowed it, and we haven't seen any issues so far, is a reason to believe that there isn't an issue.
Okay, so I don't really find either of those arguments persuasive. The second argument, like the world is full of security problems, which we discover and then we have to deal with them. You may have heard of Spectre. I don't find that very persuasive argument. The former argument, the problem, as I said, is not the initial delegation. It's the subsequent management of those domains, which, as I say, do not form an operational part of the infrastructure, and therefore do not need to be secured the way that the forward part of the domains do. They're operating, but if they go wrong, nothing happens. And so the security control source, those need to subject. And the reason that it's acceptable to have quasi-acceptable to have DV is because of face sharing between the thing you do the checking with and the thing that's operational as part of the system. That's simply not true here.
Well, if we have, presumably all browsers can chip in if they do not think these methods are secure or not.
Hi, Eric Riscorla, Mozilla.
Okay, well, but currently Mozilla root program policy dictates that those methods are allowed. So if you disagree that they're secure, that seems like that's something that should be implemented through both the CAB forum and Mozilla root policy.
And IETF, who is endorsing this method if you would publish this document.
Okay.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
So I do disagree with Eric here, which, there's a matter of the policy and Ryan Sleevey, Google. So I disagree with Ecker on the security part. So there's the separation of the policy and the technical means. And I do think it's appropriate to separate out between the expression of the IP address and the certificate and whether or not from a policy perspective that is a sufficient level of validation. And I totally appreciate Eric's concern that it may not be inappropriate from a policy side. And I agree that if it is not acceptable on policy, then policy should express that. And so I'm supportive of having the technical means to address that. To the point of the CA browser forum, we are going through and overhaul the validation methods to re-examine the security properties, both of domain name validation, which today we have 32248, which allows anyone who controls any IP address that a domain resolves to can get a certificate for that domain based on, and the assumption there is, well, if you can use things like ACME, HTTP or TLS ALPN, then it makes no difference. Why not just let you do the IP address itself? That they are commutative properties. And so here, when we're talking about IP addresses, I agree that if we trust IANA in the same way that we trust domain ICANN to handle the domain name delegation and properties, then it's no different. The question is policy, and I think that is not for us to decide here, and we should instead formalize this validation method and then let the policy groups that handle this policy address it as appropriate. The only thing that could potentially be beneficial here is, and this is something the CA browser forum was working through, which is the security property of expressing an IP address subject alt name and the validation of that IP address subject alt name are different than the security properties of expressing a DNS name subject alt name through the validation of the IP address. And so we treat those as separable problems. So this, I think, is appropriate for an IP-based validation for an IP SAN. It may not be appropriate for an IP-based validation of a DNS SAN.
Yep, agreed.
Colin Jennings. We've tried to use these types of reverse records for spam mitigation and reputation stuff in basically spam prevention, and they're wrong all the time. Like it's crazy to think that these are accurate on a widespread basis. They're often wrong, and there's nothing to fix them. So I was not actually aware that CAB issued certificates that way. That really deeply alarms me.
Yeah, by wrong, do you mean initially delegated to the wrong person or delegated?
I mean,
by
the
a third
current
party?
record that is there is not right. And I don't know how that happened or
Record
why,
or-
but it's wrong.
Record or delegation? Like the person who controls the zone is not the person who actually controls the address, or that there is stuff there that is, not relevant to what you're doing?
What do you mean not relevant to what we're doing?
Well,
What do you mean?
You said the record is wrong. Is it the delegation of the zone that is wrong, or the content of the zone that is wrong?
The end result of whatever, who knows which one of those things gets you, the end answer that comes back is wrong. And which part of it was wrong or where it went wrong, don't know, don't care. It's still wrong.
Okay.
Tony Finch, speaking as a DNS operator and ex-postmaster, I'm painfully aware that the reverse DNS is a cesspit and cannot be trusted. To reinforce the point that Eric made about the DNS reverse DNS not being operationally important, and therefore operators pay very little attention to its accuracy and validity, which is why it's such a mess. From the point of view of how the reverse DNS delegations relate to responsibility for routing, in a typical enterprise, the DNS will be the responsibility of one team, and the routing will be a responsibility of a completely separate team. And whether they actually talk to each other in an effective way is not guaranteed.
Petr Špaček, CZNIC. I also come from DNS working group. I wasn't aware of this ACME thingy up until now, and with my TLD operator hat on and open recursive resolver hat on, please don't do this, because the reverse DNS is just plain broken. I mean, there are big parts of the reverse DNS tree which don't even resolve, don't even have DNS servers behind them, because nobody cared enough to put a DNS server in there. Also, big chunks of DNS reverse tree are not signed using DNSSEC. So, I mean, this part of DNS is the dark corner you certainly don't want to even peek at. So please don't.
Lars, in one net node, while I'm essentially in the same camp, I do have one thing that in the other side of the scales, which is, could this be perceived as secure? This is a question because I don't know all the details. Could this be perceived as actually useful in a local environment where you have a local trust anchor for your reverse tree? Because then when you're in control of the entire environment, so to speak, the security parameters are totally different.
Yeah.
But for the larger internet, I'm on their side.
Okay.
Relaying for Tom Peterson, shouldn't the challenge response be connect to the IP and perform a challenge response handshake of sorts, or is the lack of connectivity between both ends an immutable requirement? I think this is a result to the reverse DNS. Like,
that's the other challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I briefly realized something like that. The direct connection to the IP address is what the other challenges are for the HTTP and TLS based ones.
Off-topic point, could you speak your name, because my eyesight is going and I cannot see you at the mic when I'm typing. The point I was going to make is I am not sure whether CAB forum rules allow it. I will have to check to see whether they do. And if they do, I'll be putting in a ballot proposal to shut them down because I don't like this.
Okay, well, section 3.2.2.5, you may want to look at.
There's where your PR should go. This is Richard Barnes. So I have some sympathy with Sleevy's argument that it is ultimately a policy decision what property of the technical infrastructure PCAs want to rely on to validate these things. But But by and large, I think Ecker and Fluffy are on the right track here in terms of the security properties of this thing. So, I mean, I could envision a universe where, there was a compelling need to rely on this sort of thing for some large set of critical use cases that couldn't do anything else. And it was the IETF's job to design the best possible mechanism that could be done under those constraints. I'm not convinced we've quite met that bar yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the interest of moving this forward, I think it might be better to kind of take this out of the document for now,
mm-hmm.
go forward with the ones we know we're okay with. And then if there is a real demand for this, maybe we could come back later.
Sure. Right. Well, given that the last slide is probably not that interesting. This is basically just a proposed change to the reverse DNS challenge that would do it in a slightly different way, but still using the reverse zone. And given people's objections to that, probably it doesn't make sense to talk about it right now.
Right. So Ryan Sleevey again. So just since it seems like a lot of people are surprised about what goes on in the CA browser forum, that no one's read the baseline requirements, it sounds like. The property that is currently relied on for IP address validation is the assumption that the RRNIC has provided correct information. So in the set of methods acceptable to validate an IP address, you assume that the RRNIC is provided, and you can contact, if you reach out to the RRNIC like Aaron or Ripe, and you can get an email address for saying who owns this net block, anyone who has such a record can cause issuance for any of the IP addresses. Similarly, if we believe that the reverse DNS has been delegated to that entity, then separating whether or not we believe that that entity has been operating it correctly, it meets that property of a delegation existing. But because of all this, I'm actually going to disagree with Richard's suggestion, which is CAs today can fully use any possible interpretation they want, right? And this is something that the CA browser forum is working through, and we've already identified that a number of CAs have been using these properties in a variety of ways. And the forum is interested in providing standardized means for this. So I actually would suggest that continuing forward and working through this issue has a better outcome, because the alternative is simply anything goes. And that is actually something explicitly in language 3225 section 4 is anything the CA deems as acceptable meeting these properties goes. And we'd like to remove that. So we'd like to find properties like this. So it is worth considering discussion that if people care about it and want to have an influence in what the future of the WebPKI looks like, this is a great venue. Or if you don't want to have it in this venue, then certainly we have the CA browser forum to solicit these comments, and we very much want to understand these security properties that people feel are not met, separate from the operational. So whether or not those security properties are operational considerations of the RRNICs or operational considerations of people who've been delegated to.
Okay, so go to the next presentation.
Yeah. Hopefully this one should be a bit less conscientious.
Controversial. Okay, so that's the TLS.
Yeah.
Do you want the clicky of justice?
No, you can just go to the next one.
All right.
So this is a replacement for TLS SNI. For those who haven't been following along on the list, there was a rather big issue with TLS SNI that was discovered in the wild. Basically boils down to hosting providers allowing users to claim arbitrary SNI names. So you would go to a big hosting provider and register your account, and then you would be able to tell them, hey, I serve traffic for invalid.acme. This allowed people to basically serve traffic for the computed, supposedly invalid SNI names that TLS SNI validation relied on, which is not good. Basically, we still think there is a use case for TLS validation, specifically for load balancer, TLS load balancers and hosting providers. So we came up with TLS ALPN. Basically, this method is very similar to TLS SNI, but with two major differences. The first is that we negotiate ALPN protocol, which basically enforces the property that TLS ALPN validation is opt-in. Unless your server is blindly echoing ALPN values, which we really don't want people to do and is bad. And from our testing, no one seems to be doing, so we're not worried about it yet. And the second property is that we actually use the name being validated in the SNI extension this time instead of an invalid constructed name. This means that we actually get the property that we know we are talking to the person who has claimed that name. In TLS SNI, that still would have been a problem, because if you hadn't enabled HTTPS on your site on a hosting provider, someone else would still have been able to claim that name. But with ALPN, we hope that any hosting provider that chooses to offer this understands the security property and won't actually allow arbitrary people to claim SNI names, which they aren't actually serving traffic for. So the method is quite simple. You connect to the host, you initiate a TLS handshake, and the client hello has to contain the ALPN extension, ACME TLS. That name is up for debate. Some people have suggested other things. An SNI extension containing the name being validated. You then verify the server hello has echoed back the ALPN extension with only the ACME TLS value, and they have sent a self-signed certificate for the name being validated that contains a critical extension that contains the validation token. You then compare that token as what you expect, and if it is, you have succeeded. Any questions?
Ben Schwartz, Google. Have you considered including a bad ALPN that must not be echoed?
We have not, but that seems like a good idea.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, this seems to sort of rely on an accidental property, namely that sites don't just not ignore, but effectively consent to whatever ALPN you offer them. Mm-hmm. I assume the rationale for using ALPN is that you think that random TLS, it's too hard for random TLS servers to process a different extension that you've made up.
Yep.
So I guess one question I have is, do random HTTP servers actually allow you to configure the ALPN settings?
Apache and Nginx don't allow you to configure it, but we are not. I don't think the use case for this challenge is people using off-the-shelf web servers and configuring it themselves. If Apache or Nginx want to add support for the TLS ALPN challenge internally to it, then I think that's what we would hope for.
Sure. I guess the reason I'm getting at is basically all modern TLS stacks are having to add external extension processing in order to support Quick. Mm-hmm. And so given that you're doing something which like there's no natural surface area for, why not define a new TLS extension with semantics that are not echoable? For instance, I don't know, like, the response to the message digest to the input that like you absolutely be confident that no random server will do.
I think the main argument is that there probably do exist existing TLS stacks which will happily just ignore things they don't understand, and that even if you say this is a critical extension, that... No, I
don't mean that. That's exactly my point. My point is that the way the server would get so in your case you say the server hello contains an ALPN extension containing ACME TLS 1. By the way, in TLS 1.3 that should be EE, but anyway, so right now you're relying on the server. So all TLS servers ignore ALPN they don't recognize.
Yep.
So I mean, some of them may then refuse to serve the connection, but so you're relying on the echo here as a relevant point.
Yeah.
And so what I'm suggesting is that echo something that is
a new
echo something that is not generatable by really copying the input. Yeah, so there's a random value in the extension, and then the response is, I don't know, like a HMAC of like something in the spec and the value. And then like, I mean, I agree it's hard to implement in the principle, but the fact that like the TLS stacks having to extend themselves anyway suggests that maybe it's not actually hard to implement, and it's like much higher, like doesn't rely on like accidental properties of the way servers are designed.
So Ryan Slavey, Google. The ALPN spec covers this, right? Like this was the part of the difference between ALPN and NPN was saying that the server should not echo the protocol if it does not actually speak that protocol. And so to this point, like if we're saying we can no longer rely on servers properly implementing the spec, and I totally like, we have enough reason to be cynical about everything, but it is something that I think we may want to take back then to the TLS working group and say like, we have this property, we'd like to rely on it. And if sorry, as TLS chair, you're saying like, or former, don't rely on that, then it seems like there's that interconnect. So that was, yeah, I was a proponent of doing the ALPN for precisely this reason. Was the spec says you should not blindly echo. NPN had that property where you could do this. You get the client sends one thing and the server can send a different value that the client didn't echo, and we moved away from that in TLS. It's a must. Yeah. It's on the must, and that was part of the same concern. Was if it's a should, then yes, we can't rely on it. But it was a must from if it doesn't actually speak that protocol.
For the record, I think this is probably safe, but that's like the level of assurance I have.
Phil Baker, I err on the side of more cynicism. As far as the legacy servers is concerned, ACME is a protocol that I've always believed will pretty quickly, once it's been standardized, merge into the servers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we will get a new generation of servers turning over relatively rapidly. So I'm not that worried about the legacy base. And further, as far as the legacy base is concerned, I'm only concerned that there is one way that they're able to do it, not that they have access to absolutely every possible method. I don't think that we need to over worry about the legacy base. Just allow them so that it is possible for enough percentage of the time, and if it's not, well, they can upgrade the server.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I think the key point here is that you basically have close to just one bit of information coming back from the server's response here. But if you make a new extension, which, as Eka pointed out, is actually relatively easy in modern stacks, you can do the whole challenge in the extension, and that gives you 128 bits or what have you in there. And I'd be far more confident with that. I think this is a pretty good idea. And I also like the fact that you have the SNI is for the intended host, and the certificate is valid for the intended host, and that's a great property to maintain. Which means the SNI means that you get to the destination that is most probably the right one. And the fact that the certificate is valid, it also means that someone actually has to go to the effort of making it at least a semi-plausible certificate. Of course, it's not going to chain to anything reasonable. So I think that's consider it a friendly amendment.
Thank you.
Ben Schwartz, Google. So I have no opinion on using ALPN for this versus using an extension, but I just want to reiterate that it would be relatively straightforward to render this strongly immune to any accidental usage in the ALPN mode. And if you don't think that it's good enough to offer ACME TLS 0 and ACME TLS 1 and require 0 not to be returned, but require 1 to be returned, then you can do fancier things like make an ALPN that contains a hash of the SNI and require that to be the one that's returned, and include another one that doesn't match the hash, require that not to be returned, or endless permutations.
Yep.
Okay, any more? Oh, thank you. That's been, well, I don't know if the term is constructive or destructive, but either way. Okay. Yep.
Okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and do the.
You want the clicky of justice?
We'll see how this works. If I can push the right dang button. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Okay, CERN ACME, and I think we've talked about this before, but people that don't do arty stuff. Basically what we're trying to do, and it's something we tried to do, how long ago? 17 years ago we tried to. Okay, sorry, we tried to solve this problem about 17 years ago in SIP Core Working Group. Now we're finally really trying to solve it because it's become a huge problem. So the notion is we're going to provide cryptographic authentication for telephone calls. We're going to try and detect the impersonation so that we can block these calls. So you guys, we're trying to solve your problem getting all these dang spam calls on your phones. Okay. And what we're doing is we're using 8226, which talks about how we're going to use certificates. So we currently have, as was mentioned before, 2 ACME working group documents to support STIR. One, we have the telephone one that was focused on how you do challenge responses for TNs. And then we had one that came in because of the work we were doing in ADIS NNI task force, where we were basically, rather than doing TNs and certificates per TNs, we have certificates per some service providers identifiers that we call service provider codes. And these are existing things that service providers use within the network to uniquely identify them. So we had that document. And both of these were agreed as working group documents. So where are we now? So when I was discussing the service provider document at IETF 99 in Prague, the work group suggested, well, this looked like something that could be evolved into a generic token mechanism. So at IETF 100, and John and I, we talked a little bit, but we kind of worked a little independently. I had taken the service provider document and I took it pretty literally and came up with a very simple token challenge response mechanism. And so that's the Barnes ACME token challenge, and then there's the service provider document that explains how we'd use that generic token mechanism. And one thing I want to highlight is I updated draft Barnes ACME token challenge, not because I'm suggesting we progress it right now, but because I had a very overt error, and I can be really OCD and pedantic about things, and I didn't want to leave that out there. Then John also had a proposal that was kind of applicable to a broader range of applications. You know, he thinks bigger picture. And at that IETF 100, the work group said, you know, you guys really should come up with a combined proposal. So that's where we are today. And John's going to talk about the generic mechanism, authority token mechanism. And then Chris is going to go into the details on how we're going to use this for both TNs and service provider codes. Okay?
Hi, I'm John. Mary already gave the intro, so I'm not going to go too much into what STIR is or how we got here. The basic idea, again, is that we're going to use the certificate authority. We're going to have a proof. It's going to look something like a traditional ACME challenge, and that will result in an ACME client getting a cert, and that cert can be used to sign communications. We wanted to get something that would be generic to both the service provider case that Mary was describing and telephone numbers as well. And so when we started doing this generically, so what we decided was the JOT token, the JSON web token that was being used for the service provider code proposal could probably be just genericized into something that could work for basically any identifier type you want to issue a challenge for, provided that you believe there is some authority out there that has a trust relationship with the CA such that that authority could generate one of these JOTs. You could then, when you receive a challenge as an ACME client, go off to this token authority and say, okay, this is the kind of challenge I got. I'm going to do whatever tests with you that have anything to do with ACME. They're completely out of band of it. This entity may already know who you are. For the service provider case that ADIS is concerned about, for example, there are already authorities who ascertain which carriers have these particular service provider codes. And in the United States, there's this thing that's called NECA, that actually issues these OCNs that end up being used in the PSTN today. And so this began from the notion, oh, you could go to this authority token, in this instance, something that is NECA or adjacent to NECA, has access to its same database. And from that, get a token you then would present to the CA in order to get your ACME certificates for that particular identifier. So we just abstracted that out all the way, though, to the notion that pretty much any identifier or identifier type you could put into a challenge, well, there should be a way you can then identify a token authority who is authoritative for that, and they can give you whatever token you need to prove it to the CA. So this could be something that could be applicable to virtually any identifier we're considering, even domain names. You could imagine you were actually going to like network solutions, for example, and saying, okay, I have an account with you. I've received this challenge from an ACME, a Boulder instance. Here's what it showed me. Now, if you can give me a token, I can then bring that back to the CA, and you don't even have to do the kind of DNS proof that we originally discussed here in ACME. Obviously, I think the DNS proof here in ACME is fine, but things for IP addresses, things for any kind of non-internet resource that you imagine you might want to issue a certificate for could potentially fall under the rubric of this authority token. And the way that we did this is we just defined a registry of these TK auth types. We defined one that's called ATC for the authority token challenge. We did this in case, like, for some reason somebody didn't want to do this with JOT, right? Like, we thought we'd just like build in one more layer of indirection in case somebody's like just utterly against everything that came out of the Jose working group and wants to use some alternative form of token for this. So we have that layer of modularity in this, but we're really only pre-registering in this document this one option, this ATC token, which, as I said, is a JOT. The token authority there is a URL that is optional, that can tell you where you need to go to get the kind of token that the Boulder instance is asking you for in this case. And that isn't mandatory to follow. It may be that the client has out-of-band knowledge of this. For example, precisely in this ATIS and an I case, you already know who the authority it is that you need to go talk to. You do not need an ACME server to be telling you which token authority to take this to yourself. And this is kind of what we imagine you might get back in terms of what you would pass back to the ACME server from the client, having acquired a JOT from that token authority. You see it's down there in the payload. We have a payload type that is defined as ATC. The little part in bold there with the ... net, imagine that is all the base 64 encoding of the JOT inside of that. And based on seeing that, you get your certificate for that instance. We've talked a bit about this in kind of a small internal design team that we formed based on being told last time, please come back with like one proposal instead of like 16 ways you might do this. So Chris and I, and also Mary and Dave Hancock, talked a bit about this, since Dave is doing some of the work on the ATIS side. One thing we ran into pretty quickly, the way that I hacked this together, I assumed that we needed a way to bind the challenge that you receive from the ACME server to whatever you get back from the token authority. So I said, oh, we'll just take the nonce, like from the reply nonce, and jam that into the information that we give to the token authority. And so that would then end up being put into the JOT itself. And based on its presence there, then the ACME server would know, okay, this actually was a response to the challenge that I issued. This does have some design implications, and there are alternatives to this. This is kind of an open issue for us, I think, at the moment. You could instead use a fingerprint of the ACME credential that makes it clear that, yes, this is the right ACME account for this that is asking for it. And so the difference here really being that use of the token is one that, say, if you were doing short-term certs or something where you needed to go back and get certs very frequently from the ACME server, then it would be beneficial to have a token that was tied to the fingerprint of the client rather than to each individual challenge that you received, right? Because this just reduces the number of times that you need to go and get more tokens from the token authority. So this is something that we're still thinking about. I know we talked a bit to Richard Barnes about this. I don't know if just at this level of discussion of the document, we need to delve into the open issues. I mean, I think really mostly what we're here to ask today is, you asked us to come back with like one thing. We have come back with one thing. And like this is kind of the consolidated approach that we want to take. Do people think this is reasonable to have this, first of all, this very generic token capability for ACME? Are there other use cases people are interested in for this, other than the ones that are related to telephone numbers that people want to bring to the table? The people don't like this approach, think it should be less generic, because there are less generic ways to do this as well, if people are so inclined. So do people have like initial fundamental thoughts about that?
Yeah, Mary Barnes. I mean, it would be good to hear from the people, and I don't remember exactly who it was that suggested that the mechanism I had presented could be made generic, right?
I think it was me.
Oh, no, there was somebody, no, there was somebody else in this room, right? Okay, but it would be good to understand your use case for this, right? Or is it just a philosophical thing? Okay.
Isn't philosophy good enough? Yeah, I mean, so I don't have personally a way I would put this to use immediately, but it's something I think could be good for the ecosystem in a few different ways. I've had some conversations with registries about providing the sort of things you were talking about for DNS names, and I think that would be a way to issue DNS certificates with a higher level of assurance than with these empirical validations without needing humans in the loop. So I think having a mechanism on the table that could be readily adapted could make those conversations easier, could make experiments easier, and those sort of things. I mean, even rolling in the IP address domain, you can imagine using like RPKI certs to do a higher assurance thing, which still has some accuracy data quality issues, but we'll ignore this for the moment. So yeah, I think this, in general, this approach is pointed in the right direction. I think probably some of these layers of indirection could be collapsed out a little bit with some assumptions about what the tokens will look like. You know, so I think I'd probably be fine saying JWT, because if for some reason someone cannot possibly live in the JWT envelope, like we'll just mint a new challenge type for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, +1 to all this.
Okay.
Oh, on the how to bind thing.
Yeah.
I guess I've got without having thought about this real deeply, I think it seems to me the binding to the account key is probably the more natural thing, given that what the token authority is probably going to be thinking of is who has what resources, not who is doing what transactions with which resources. And so, you know, without having concrete examples on hand about how these tokens would be issued, it seems like the challenge-based approach, the non-spaced approach, kind of presumes that the token issuance process can operate sufficiently quickly to be in-band to the issuance process.
Also true, yeah.
Which seems kind of an unnecessary requirement unless you're really getting some valuable restriction out of it, as opposed to just being enabling the account holder to go get a token that expresses its resources in general, or however he wants to slice them up.
Yeah.
And then be able to use those
I mean,
to do issuances.
The greatest single liability of the approach of doing it with the nonces is that it does not play well with short-term certs, certainly.
Okay, so that's not necessarily true, right? Because you can do a challenge once, get an authorization that lasts some time,
yeah,
and then do multiple issuances.
Oh, okay.
Under that.
Oh, that's true. That's true, actually. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a little hard to reason about this because we have,
that way.
as you said, we have so many layers of indirection in this.
Yeah,
it's a little hard to
yeah.
reason about. But yeah, so there's not necessarily that type binding, which honestly is part of what gives me doubts about the nonce approach, because it's a little hard to think about what useful constraint you're getting out of binding things to the challenge.
Yep. I am happy to do this with fingerprints, but with nonce, that is not.
Yeah, Mary Barnes. So, I mean, I have a question just to throw this out. Would it be possible to have this flexible and you could do either? I mean, I like the fingerprint idea, but I'm just.
I mean, it is possible. I mean,
Okay.
I could imagine even being like an attribute of the challenge, right? Of
Right.
which one you require, and it could be that for some applications you care, some namespaces you care more than others. I don't know.
Right. I mean, since we don't clearly have a broad sweep of use cases right now, right?
I mean, I think if we did one thing to start, and I am sympathetic to Richard saying we could probably just collapse down the layer of indirection and just have this be jot, and if someone needs to do something else, we'll do something else. That's fine. Doing this with like one thing that we think is going to work for at least the few use cases we have in
that's
mind is
fine.
probably
Yep.
okay, because then we can just add more later if we want more.
Okay. Yep.
Chris Wana. I was just going to agree with Richard's thoughts. I tend to think that, although like you, I think I'm flexible.
Sure.
Nonce does tie you to every transaction. Fingerprint is a little more flexible in terms of not having to get a token per, if you have tons of certificate requests, maybe that's one other consideration,
Also true.
So.
Richard Barnes, if we think there is some real uncertainty about what the right answer here is, and we're not comfortable just like picking one, it would be helpful to see some examples of what the token issuance processes might look like, right? If whoever is issuing the TN tokens or OCN tokens or SPID tokens is insisting on manual processes that involve like sending paperwork to FCC, then yeah, we should probably bind to accounts and not challenges.
Yeah, I doubt it will be that. At least I hope it won't be that.
Well, we hope, Mary Barnes again, we hope it won't be manual, but yeah. But I just want to mention right now what we have in the Shaken certificate management specification is the fingerprint.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I'm happy to do fingerprint for the time being, but I think from that we're going to go to Chris.
Okay. So, this is essentially the corresponding draft, I guess, defined sort of as a profile of the one we just talked about, specific to ACME usage for creating RFC 8226 certificates, the STIR certificates draft, and specifically for providing an authenticated, authorized way of indirectly incorporating the TN auth list into the certificate as defined by our RFC 8226. And I think we already talked about, this is really specifically for cases of telephone service providers. The basic overview here, I sort of given like a high level thing is, a communication service provider has the authority to represent a certain set of telephone numbers, ranges, or service provider code. They want a new certificate and make a CSR request through ACME. And we get a challenge back with the identifier TN auth list. The CSP has a relationship. We have definition for that, as Mary mentioned, in the Shagan documents for what that relationship is. It happens to be an interface just to get the token with authentication, and then that authorized service will provide a valid token back with the TN auth list and the fingerprint, etc. And then CSP responds, the ACME challenge. Challenge is validated and then creates the RFC 8226 compliance certificate. That's the high level process.
So just to make sure I understand, the idea is that the token will contain, okay, you say token contains TNs and SPCs, and the idea is that those will correspond directly to the extension that is expected to be included in the certificate?
Exactly.
Okay.
The TN auth list is explicitly included in that token.
I guess the question is more about the SPCs. Are those things that can also be represented in a TN auth list?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, there's three choices in 8226: SPC, TN, and TN range.
Right. Mary Barnes again. And so this is a big difference between what I had, right? I had SPCs totally separately out. So yeah, even though that SPC would have had to have been in the TN auth list.
Okay, so we define a new identifier of type TN auth list. We also define the value, which is, we define it as a JSON array of TN auth list components. And as I just mentioned, that there's three types, SPC, TN, and TN range. I show an example here of a new order that includes that. And in this specific one, there's both an SPC and a TN as part of that down in the identifiers. One issue I wanted to ask about is in ACME, the value of the identifier type is defined to be a string, and obviously we want to put a JSON string, JSON in there. So, you know, I'm asking for, should we be stringifying it, or should we consider changing that, or you know, what's a good path forward there? We can avoid escape characters too. I don't know.
So I'll consider these the first IETF last call comments on
I
the spec. I think that the right answer, well, I mean, someone probably from the JSON Mafia is probably going to come knife me for saying this, but I think the right answer is probably to say that the content of the value field should be specified by the type field of the identifier, meaning when you get an identifier object, it'll have a type field that says, you know, what type it is, and then the value will be in the value field, but it might be a string, or it might be an array, or it might be whatever the type specifies it is. We should slightly more serious. We should probably get some feedback from JSON folks as to whether that's the right answer.
Sure.
Or maybe we should do something like we've done with challenges, where you use names other than value.
Okay. Should I assume that, or well, we can hear more comments.
Yeah, John, I mean, the slippery slope, of course, is, you know, ASN.1. Like, you know, this is the problem. I mean, you know, because we're taking this directly out of the cert, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, it was occurring to me as I was sitting back there that, probably part of defining an identifier needs to be, how does this thing appear in a certificate? So because there's implicitly a mapping between these JSON objects talking about identifiers and how they go into certs. We're kind of relying on, it's kind of assumed in the case of domain names, but it's different here because TNAuth list is, I think, its own extension. Yeah. It's not a SAN. And so it would, I think we're clear in this case, but yeah, in general, there's a need to map between the two.
John Peterson, I thought there was actually a strength of this approach, or making it this generic to the TNAuth list itself, is I mean, it just kind of makes sense. What we're sending challenges for and passing around in tokens should be the thing that is going to go in the cert, right? If there's any kind of like a conversion or something that's being applied, why would we possibly want that? And so everyone should be syntactically and semantically saying what is going to actually end up in the cert at the end of the day. It should be clear.
So you're advocating for ASN1? Is that what I'm hearing? Or was that a joke?
I'm advocating that Richard solve this problem during last call. That's what I'm advocating, that we figure out whatever the mechanism is that is required to make sure that we know exactly what.
I'm sorry, did you just suggest that this should be like base64 encoded ASN1 extension content?
Possibly. So possibly it should. I mean, it should be syntactically and semantically, to the degree possible, identical to what we're going to put in the cert. Or why shouldn't it, Russ?
I certainly see advantage to that. I can see pushback, like that people have to understand ASN1 on various components, but I don't know if that's a good argument or not.
Yeah, Mary Barnes, we have the ASM1 situation elsewhere in what we're doing for Shaken too. So if we can solve it here, right? With our TNAuth list, I mean, not our valid CA list.
Well, my argument is only the CA needs to understand how to synthesize the ASN1 right now.
Russ Housley, the TNAuth list structure is quite simple. It's a choice of three things: a string, a string, a string, and a length. Okay.
Right.
So
actually,
it seems to be, the question is, how do you want to encode the length? Otherwise, the other three choices are pretty obvious.
Well, that's the input into the ASN1, right?
And so it seems like there's sort of two plausible operating points here. On the one hand, if you want to go the more ASN1 route, then just generate the extension and base64 encode it and shove it in as a string. No need to change the base spec. On the other hand, if you want to have something that's more readable and described in JSON, that you will then define a mapping to the ASN1, then we'll need to change the base spec. I'm going to pass the ball to Matt Miller to see whether that second solution is plausible.
So as far as Matthew Miller, so as far as the mappings go, somebody has started to define a JSON encoding rules for ASM1. And please, and after looking at that, as meh as I might be with just doing the TNAuth list encoded, ultimately what matters is what goes into the certificate, and what, as far as other processing of it, it doesn't seem to be very relevant. So just let it be exactly what you expect it to be into the certificate, and just let it be base64 encoded, or it's even possible you could do it as a binary string, but there's some rules you'll have to follow for that. The base64 would be safer.
Okay. I actually had not considered that option, so I guess I want to think about it, but my gut reaction is that the authority and the service provider as actors would have to encode and decode that, which would be a little bit of a pain. Not, doable, but
Russ Housley, the CA already knows how to deal with ASN1, obviously.
Right.
So that's not a big deal. I think John's point is that if you are translating back between multiple representations, you could lead to someone making a surprising assumption somewhere and resulting in a identifier you didn't intend. That's easily avoided if you provide the blob, you decode the blob, it makes sense or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you fail. I totally speak against using the JSON encoding rules in ASN1. I tried to read them once. And blah.
I agree. That is a pro.
I'll put it this way: if we're concerned about this being about the ASN1 being unintelligible to any of the actors in this, then I wouldn't mind as a hint having some conversion that shows you what it is, but the canonical representation has to actually also be in it, right? And whether that's base 64 or whatever, because otherwise I do think if there's misunderstandings about how you're supposed to convert between these things, it could give rise to, there could be real serious security vulnerabilities that could arise from that, right? I mean...
Phil Harnbaker, I'm not at all convinced by this readability argument. This is not stuff that a user is ever going to see.
Right.
The only time anybody's going to see it is when they're trying to debug something. The only time they're going to be debug something is when something has gone wrong, and the person who's debugging it is going to be reading a cert that's in ASN1.
Yep.
And so when I think of the mental leaps, I think the shortest distance between 2 points is NSA 1 backwards. I don't like ASN1 any more than anybody else does. I've written 4 ASN1 compilers, and I would like to have no new ASN1, but this is not new ASN1. It's not spreading the infection any further, so we don't need to worry. Let's just do it.
Okay, and just to be sure, we're cutting the line after Matt because we're running out of time.
Okay. Well, first, relaying Wilhelm. I can't pronounce the last name. I apologize. He asks, will the JSON encoding destroy the CSR compliance? But for myself, I was also going to say I regret ever mentioning the JSON encoding rules. Please just put in, and especially in, the canonicalization is a really important one, and getting that right in JSON, as you guys saw with Passport, is really effing hard. So
But you're going to help us.
Just a quick closing comment as Acme Spec author. So what I'm taking away from this is the answer is MIIFAZ. What I'm taking away from this is there's not a change needed in the base spec for this, at least.
Right. No.
Okay.
Specific to this. Yeah. So I'll take that away as pretty good support for ASN1. And did we resolve the, I think the value, is that yet to be determined, or should I assume that in my next rev that the value can be?
Is everything that's discussed in a working group meeting, the answer is take it to the list?
Correct. That's what I was suggesting.
I suggest you take a version that does the base 64 ASN1 thing to the list, and yes, people can talk about it then.
Yeah. I'm not going to write text about how to stringify JSON, basically. So yeah. I need to take Richard's approach and learn how to speak ASN1. Challenge. Okay, so this is all per the ATC spec, so I don't think I need to go through that. The real thing that we're newly defining in this spec is the format of the ATC claim. And obviously that incorporates the TN auth list, and this will also contain what we decide in terms of ASN1 versus JSON. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward.
Just go back to make sure that, so that the last thing there, you see the ATC claim, and it has like 3 things in it. There's like the SPC code, a TN code, and then either the nonce or the fingerprint. So here I think we're showing the nonce, but that we will move that to
that
fingerprint.
Would contain the fingerprint.
For the next version.
Yep. Thank you, John. I have a couple of examples in here. I don't know if I need to go through this for this crowd. It's just variations on whether there's a SBC value or SBC and TNs or things like that. They're in the draft, unless somebody has specific comments about that. Next steps. So I think we talked about that, we had 2 different documents. We came in with these new 2 documents. There's a big dependence on this for some of the telephone stuff that we're doing for Stir and Shaken. So the proposal is that we take these documents and replace the existing documents.
Yeah, so there's a +1 to that. I was just going to ask a clarifying question a couple slides back on the token format.
Sure.
So the ATC value there is still in JSON. So the question is whether now that we're going to encode the identifier in ACME is base 64 encoded ASN1, whether the token should also use that encoding. That doesn't seem like a clear answer because you might have differences between what's in here and what you might put in a certificate, right? If you have an auth list from which you're selecting a number.
My assumption would be that it would all be the same.
Oh, okay.
Right? No?
Well,
I thought that's what we were discussing before.
So I think
Or
it's
that
going
was the implication of what we were discussing
Well, so
before.
yeah, this is an implication that perhaps wasn't obvious, which is why he's bringing it up. But so where we have TN auth list there, right? That's the identifier type that we're dealing with. And so that then will key that what is going to appear in the second thing that's now an array there of SPC and TN is instead going to be the base 64 encoded blob. Got it?
Right.
Russ says that I'm correct. So I'm obviously right. Does that make sense? Because the point is, so you think about this. This is the type that, followed by the identifier.
Yes.
And so this is what we would have seen in the challenge, is the point, right? We don't want to take what's in the challenge and interpret it and munge it and transcode it into something that might not necessarily be semantically identical, right?
But so we were talking about assigning these tokens to the holder of an account key, right? So are you saying that I shouldn't be able to get a token that says I hold this range of numbers and then request a certificate for a specific number? Well, if you require equality, of course, then it doesn't allow that. But if you allow for comparison,
No, I think the policy should be to
it seems like
explicitly ask for what you want.
No, I see what you're saying. So again, I'm assuming, and this is one of the reasons why I went with nonce, right? Because this is one of the reasons I went with nonce, right? Because I assumed it was exactly what was in the challenge in terms of the identifier and so on that you were going to have to provide a token for. And it's a different model to go get a token that describes a broader set, possibly, of names that you're authorized to acquire certificates for than what you were actually challenged about in the first place, right? And yeah, that is a decision we need to make going forward of this, of whether we want to have one or both of those ways of doing it. And I think one or both are both rational, right?
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think we should take that back and consider that.
I mean, but yeah, that would be the work we'll do as we then develop this, right? I mean, what we're trying to accomplish here today is just to say, you asked us to come back with one thing, we got one thing. These are roughly the properties it'll provide. We don't need to, working class call it today, but like you see the direction we're taking this, and do people think it's cool?
Okay, so having said that, if we look at this proposal, let's take a hum. Does anybody, just one hum, not two, does anybody look at this and say, no, this is not a good idea, we should stay with the way we are? Yeah. So if you think this, or it does have to be a double hum anyway. If you think this is a good way going forward to replace both drafts with a single one, hum now. Okay. If you think this is a bad idea and that we should not do that, hum now. Oh, good, silence, so we don't have to call people to the mic to explain their position. So, okay, so we've got the authorization of the group to merge them to one document, and right.
Just to be, there's John's and then mine.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
2 for 2. Chair.
Mary Barnes. Well, we'll have to figure out, because John's, a generic could be considered a new working group draft. And then I don't know if you can replace 2 documents with the same document,
I
because that's
think
effectively what that is.
That's the idea, right?
Well, no, but if you, my concern is, again, I'm pedantic. If someone goes and looks at Acme Telephone and sees it's related to authority token, they're not going to see anything about telephone numbers. Really, the WENT document, TNOF list, subsumes both those.
Right. We'll figure out how to get it
Okay,
into
that's
the
fine.
data
That's
tracker.
fine.
Actually, the overlap isn't perfect, actually, because Acme Telephone also contains proof of possession mechanisms that you can use to do single telephone number auth things. So, I mean, it's not entirely coextensive. The point is, let's replace these things with the 2 things above.
Right, and hopefully we have decent traceability about that then.
We'll come back and do other things later if we need to do other things later.
Okay.
Okay, so last item is Acme Star.
Hello. Next. So the tagline here is that we think we are done with the edits. We removed the last 2 items from the to-do list, which were operational consideration and security consideration. In particular, regarding the operational consideration, we now define what short-term means in terms of the web use case. We create this equivalency with OCSP mass table, and so we recommend a renewal every 4 days. We looked at the CCS paper to draw some conclusion about clock skew, what to do with that. And we took figure 4 with a ruler, and we decided that the CDF told us that predating 5 to 7 days allowed 99.7% roughly tolerance. And so the other recommendation that we do is predating 5 to 7 days, depending on your use case. And then we added the third note about the certificate transparency log after a long discussion in Singapore. In Acme Trans and the Starsight meeting, is the conclusion was it's not a problem probably, but if it is a problem, then this document doesn't need to solve. So done. As I said, we added some consideration about the security of the thing, in particular, mainly about the increased DOS surface that you have, and so the related mitigations. And we also took into account a comment that John did last time in Singapore, and so basically the observation was Star is not tied to the specific identity that the short-term certificate has embedded, and so it's better decouple it from the domain name specificity, and so we now call it a identity owner, not a domain name owner, and that's it. So we think we're ready for working group last call, unless there are concerns.
Any comments? Anybody? How many have read the draft? Oh, wow, quite a few. Good. So people think this is ready for last call? I see a lot of nods from the crowd.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Ryan.
Ryan Sleevey. So I have read the draft. I think it's good for working group last call, but I am going to throw out a potential wrench, which having looked through some of the use cases and scenarios, I think it's very unlikely that this would be usable on the web PKI. So yeah, I think for an enterprise case, it is fit for task, but I do want to sort of potentially throw that out there, that for the web PKI case, for some of its considerations, the comparison between OCSP stabling, the motivating cases here and the ecosystem challenges may not make it suitable. So if it is something that we do want to see on the web PKI, we should probably talk about some of the operational considerations and deployment considerations to figure out if that's something addressable through the spec. But if it's for enterprise PKI, let's ship it.
We'd like to address the web use case. So if we have this discussion, would be nice.
Oh, what are the blockers? So one of the blockers is that CAs themselves have strong opposition to removing OCSP information or towards expressing short-lived certificates as an equivalent for OCSP. So this is a very fundamental objection, right? Because it gets to the whole point of the use case. And there have been multiple discussions in the CA browser forum for the course of 3 years now, and this matter continues to be a point of contention. So that is something that, in looking through whether it is through the analysis document that is, correlated to STAR, whether or not that needs to be firmed up, or whether it is actually to the protocol itself. So that is one of the core considerations. There is the operational deployment of, if a server is capable of deploying ACME STAR, then they're equally capable of deploying OCSP stapling, whether or not OCSP stapling meets that case. There's also, from looking through the sort of security risks and considerations, is this providing a meaningful value for the web PKI in a web PKI threat model? It does allow for the shorter lived certificates. You run into the issue, that is mentioned of like where the wild warnings are of client clock skew. But you also run into the situations where the model of continuing to reuse the same key for these short-lived certificates and rotating once you detect compromise, whether or not that actually achieves the desired security properties in a web context. And I'm particularly thinking in the case of an HTTP context. So it may be perfectly suitable for an SMTP context, right? And that's, again, going back to considerations, like I don't want to throw a wrench in here for saying this won't have a chance. But it is one that in the CA browser forum, there is a lot of strong opposition towards this model of exploring that. So there's going to be a tension here. And it's really, really hard. Because again, like I think it's mostly matured. I think it's ready for a working group last call. But in the sort of web PKI deployment case, there may and almost very likely will need to be changes both in considerations and probably in protocol to reflect that industry reality. And I don't know whether that comes as BIS, whether that comes as addendum doc. Like I don't know from a process point, and I don't want to hold up process on what can effectively be considered possibly FUD of like, CAs don't like this, but sure. But that's the consideration. So I do want to put that out there, and we should talk.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. But and it contrasts with what we had as a feedback from CAs, for example. But
I think that could you wait a second? If you read the LAMPS mailing list, there was a message today or yesterday from Dr. Pala about all his objections to short-term certificates or foregoing revocation, and you might want to read that. Okay. Yeah, because much of it applies here as well.
Yeah, I mean, from the CA browser point of view, I think the correct way of characterizing the position of the majority of the CAs on short-lived certificates is the majority of them don't care. There are a few that are interested in issuing them. The last time it came up, the biggest debate was actually, I forgot my name, I'm Tim Holleek. The biggest debate was actually between Jeremy Raleigh and me, with me actually being on the opposition side. And the opposition was actually solely based on not wanting to remove the CRL pointers from the certificates, even if they were short-lived. So the actual discussion was not whether certificates should be short-lived or not, but whether you should actually have a CRL pointer in them or whether it was okay to remove that. So that's where that went. I think, there are a lot of people, including us, who would like to see widespread adoption of short-lived certificates. There are several CAs that, especially larger ones, that have been in that camp for a long time. And so I wouldn't assume that CAs are necessarily going to come out against that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Philhan Baker. I'm no longer a CA. Yeah, I'm on the browser side now. Yeah, that's my feeling from CA Browser Forum, in that there have been a lot of people, myself included, who have been very strongly in favor of short-lived certs. However, before it is practical to do that, you have to have a standard for certificate issue and automate the whole life cycle. So your document is going to be a precondition for changing things in CAB forum. So I wouldn't make anything CAB forum blocking, because we need this draft and we need a spec before we can go to CAB forum. On the CRLs, I think that you're still going to want CRL distribution points in. You're not going to want to, you could get rid of the OCSP piece, but there is an issue where you have certificates that have been revoked for cause, where you want to actually have it on record that they were revoked at a particular time.
Which I suppose was Mac's main objection, right? Because I've talked to him, yeah, in the document we don't have any normative language in terms of OCSP or CRL distribution points, so we're completely oblivious of that.
Yeah, John Peterson, not on the web PKI, but on another use case for us, the STIR thing. We have a STIR short-lived document that I've kind of been like putting on the back burner until you made the changes. Appreciated very much. As part of this working class call, I'd be happy to go and try and plug it in and see if I find any part edges that are things that might be suggestions from that. But that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Richard Barnes, it seems like there's a lot of non-normative, non-protocol text in here that might be distracting to people in evaluating its compliance against the web PKI. It seems like the main technical protocol overlap is in this question Ryan raised about reissuance with the same key pair, same subject key pair. And that seems like a legitimate thing to discuss. It seems like a good way to flesh out whether there are comments from the web PKI community is a working group last call. Phil and Tim and Ryan, if you guys could help socialize this in the CAB forum community, I think that would be helpful to see what it looks like from that perspective.
Okay, so I'll discuss it with Rich and decide if we're going to working group last call now or
Thank you.
No, probably will anyway. So before we go, two things. First, everyone should have signed the blue sheets. If you haven't, the blue sheets are right here. Come forward and have them signed. And one other thing, I'd like you to see an email that I got during this meeting. So the base document is now in IETF last call for 4 weeks. Right. No. So thank you all for coming and sign the blue sheets.
That's welcome.
Send an email to all of you.
Yeah.
I want to make sure.
There was printed with the ACME. So.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah, you're.